Again, my name is Jacob Harris. I'm the International Student Advisor at the International Student Services Office. So if you have any questions, you're welcome to reach out to me at any time. I'll give you our contact information at the end of the presentation. So basically, thank you again for joining us. What this presentation is the information F1 students need about the NCAA NIL rules and how it affects F1s and the work authorizations that they are able to have. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get started with the presentation. And then if you have any questions or anything at the end, we'll have time for that. I don't think it's going to take the full hour, so hopefully I can get you out of here a little early. And at the very end of the presentation, I'm going to ask you to fill out a form, which I'll send to you by email. So if you can just get that back to me by tomorrow or the next day, just to verify that you received today's training. Okay, is everyone able to see the presentation? Great, thank you. Okay, so for today's agenda, I'm going to go over the F1 rules and regulations. So I'm sure you're already aware of these. This was given to you at the pre-arrival landing day webinar, or it was also possibly given to you by Kathy in her course. Or you would find this information on our website. So I'm just going to quickly go over those rules and regulations again. Then I'm going to go over what NIL is, the NCAA and the NIL announcement, how NIL affects F1 visa students. And I'm going to give you a definition of what is work, which is, the definition from immigration. And then I'm going to give you the very important St. Edward's University policy on NIL. And then we have some FAQs, frequently asked questions that we have listed on our website. So I'm going to go over those with you real quick. And then at the end, as I mentioned, I'm going to give you the information about filling out the student attestation form, just verifying that you attended today and you received this training. And then if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer those for you at the end. Okay, so the general F1 rules and regulations that you should be aware of. I'm sure you're already aware of the enrollment requirement. So an F1 student must maintain full-time enrollment in the fall and the spring semesters. Full-time enrollment for an undergraduate student is 12 credit hours, and full-time enrollment for a graduate student would be 9 credit hours. Out of those 12 or 9 credit hours, only 3 can be online. So what that means is if you're an undergraduate student, you need to have 9 hours that's face-to-face, and then your additional 3 hours could be online if you want them to be. They don't have to be, you have that option. And if you are a graduate student, it would be 6 hours in person, and then the other 3 could be online. You cannot drop below full-time enrollment without authorization from ISS beforehand. So if for any reason you need to drop a class or you feel like you might need to drop a class, you need to contact our office first so we can give you the procedures to request to drop below full-time enrollment and give you the limited options that you are able to do that. You must keep all your immigration documents valid, including your I-20 and your passport. Basically, make sure your I-20 end date hasn't passed. Make sure your passport is valid for usually at least 6 months in the future. The F1 visa stamp in your passport that you use to actually come into the country, it's okay if that expires while you're here in the US, as long as you continue to maintain your enrollment and maintain your I-20. But of course, if you leave the US for any reason, maybe to visit family or something like that, and your visa has expired, you do have to renew it at the US consulate or embassy before you return to the country. You should also be making satisfactory academic progress. So hopefully you're meeting with your success coach or an academic advisor to make sure you're on track and maintaining your GPA. If you do feel like you're falling below, a 2.0, that's when you would want to talk to our office about how that could affect your F1 status. You must request I-20 extensions before your I-20 end date. So I'm sure you're aware that on your I-20, it has an end date there for your program. Sometimes students are not always able to complete their degree in the time that's given on the I-20, which is okay. If that happens, you just need to make sure you request an extension of that I-20 before your I-20 end date passes. because once your I-20 has expired, we can no longer extend it. And then finally, the most important item is you cannot work without authorization, which is what this presentation is mainly concerning. Okay, so what is NIL? NIL stands for name, image, and likeness. Basically, it's the right of publicity. The US legal concept is prohibits your persona or celebrity to be used by others in a commercial manner to promote products or services without your consent. I'm sure you're aware of this in the athletic community. You know, a lot of stars are given hefty amount of money to wear shoes or, to wear certain sports companies' memorabilia while they're playing the game or when they're doing fan services. So that's what we mean by NIL. The legal right for US citizens and non-US citizens with work authorizations may freely exploit their persona or celebrity for commercial purposes. So I'll go into that in more detail, but the most important part of that sentence is non-citizens with work authorizations. So an example of this would be someone takes a photo of you wearing a clothing brand, and that brand uses that photo to promote their products without your consent. That means they don't have your consent, so the brand is in violation of your right of publicity. So this is a neat graphic to kind of explain what the NIL means. Name is the use of your name or any copyrighted nicknames or catchphrases. Image, use of your photos or videos of you. And of course, likeness, anything that is based on you or intended to resemble you or sound like you. That would be considered right of publicity. A few examples, again, for US citizens and non-immigrants with work authorizations would be sponsored social media posts or advertisements, sponsored videos that you might see on Twitter or YouTube or other online video services, training lessons and summer camps, and then getting paid or receiving compensation for like autographs, appearances, and merchandise sales. So when NCAA made this change last year, they basically said that college athletes now have the opportunity to benefit from their name, image, and likeness. All three divisions have adopted a uniform interim policy suspending the NCAA name, image, and likeness rules for all incoming and current student athletes in all sports. The policy provides additional guidance to members, schools, colleges, athletes, and their families. So, we have certain guidance. I'm sure your athletic department is aware of these changes. And then also they can provide additional family to either you or your family if needed. So, however, because the change to the NCAA NIL rule basically allows college students to receive compensation, SEVP, which is the Student Exchange Visitor Program, had to comment on this for international students. So an F1 student who's here in the country to obtain a degree, they're interested in doing this NCAA NIL partnership possibly. But when they reviewed the change to the NIL policy, this is basically what they said. June of last year, the Student Exchange Visitor Program announced they are aware and actively monitoring proposed federal and state legislation pertaining to the use of name, image, and likeness for student athletes, including F and N non-immigrant students. So that's basically our population is the F1 visa. The program is working with its partners within the U.S. Department of Homeland Security to review how this legislation affects international student athletes and will provide updated guidance via broadcast messages on their website, which is Study in the States, and then on social media and through their SEVP field representatives who reaches out to our office on a regular basis. So what this means is the Student Exchange Visitor Program, who manages the F1 international students in the U.S., they are aware of this change. They're aware that NCAA is now allowing student athletes to obtain compensation for their NIL. However, they haven't really changed the rules yet. So what this means for us is that currently NIL compensation would violate the F1 regulations that are in place. So unfortunately, earning NIL compensation would not be permissible for international student athletes in F1 status without having serious consequences. So that's basically why we wanted to have this training today, just to let you know that because that option is out there, many of you might be interested in pursuing those NIL opportunities. But you have to remember that the spirit of the F1 visa is to come to the US for the sole purpose of pursuing a course of study, allowing for only a limited employment and income generating opportunities while here in the US. These immigration-related employment restrictions impact the ability of student athletes in F1 status to take the advantage of the income-generating opportunities from NIL. Any student athlete who is currently in F1 or another non-immigrant status should discuss the potential immigration implications of performing any type of labor of service in exchange for payment with a competent immigration attorney. So you're certainly welcome to reach out to us with any questions that you have, but also an immigration attorney can give you guidance on the gray areas of F1 work authorization and how those are affected or allowed with NIL. All NIL opportunities conducted while in the United States by students holding an F1 visa would unfortunately violate US immigration law due to the work authorization violation. The International Student Services Office is required by law to act on submitted evidence from reports of student violations and what's confirmed report to the Department of Homeland Security through the termination of the F1 student record. So basically what that means is we're required to help you to maintain your F1 status and to make sure that the university is maintaining compliance with USCIS F1 rules and regulations. And unfortunately, with the work authorizations for F1 students, doing this type of receiving this type of compensation for NIL agreements would violate the work authorization for F1 students. And the action that we have to take is actually to terminate your F1 record for that reason. So I'm going to give you a brief overview of where NIL falls within the pyramid, I guess you would say, of organizations and immigration rules within the U.S. So you see down at the very bottom, you have your institution and your college athletic rules. Above that is the NCAA for all college and university athletes. And then the state laws, state NIL laws and state tax laws also would take precedence over the school and the NCAA rules. And then even higher than that would be the US Department of Labor and the IRS, who's basically reviewing work and active and passive income that F1 students would be receiving while here in the US. And above all of that would be the US Department of Homeland Security, again, who would manage the F1 International Student Program here in the US. And they are responsible for taking action when an F1 student is unauthorized for employment and enforce any rules or regulations that might take place because you've engaged in unemployment. And that can be anywhere from having your F1 record terminated to also deportation proceedings where they might contact you and say, I'm sorry, you have violated your F1 status due to the working without authorization. We have the ability and the authority to deport you. So we certainly don't want that to happen. So that's why we're giving you this information up front. With certain F1 violations, there's possible ways to regain that F1 status, but unfortunately that is not a possibility with unauthorized employment. So very, very important to make sure you maintain your F1 rules and regulations and you do not engage in any type of NIL compensation without first talking to our office and talking to an immigration attorney. So the types of work authorizations that F1 students can have is on-campus work. So you can work part-time, which is 20 hours a week or less on campus at St. Edward's during the fall and the spring term. You can do that by visiting the Career and Professional Development website. They have a database on there called Handshake, where you can find available on-campus positions. So if you are interested in working, you can certainly do that as long as it's part-time. If you don't have a U.S. Social Security number, then you would submit a request to our office and we would be able to issue a letter for you to apply for a U.S. Social Security card once you have that offer of employment from an on-campus department. And keep in mind, that's part-time work only, that's 20 hours a week or less. The types of off-campus work authorizations that F1 students can receive would be something called CPT and OPT. CPT is curricular practical training. This is typically an internship that you need to have to complete your academic program before you actually graduate. Or maybe it's you can obtain an internship opportunity because you have some elective credits left on your degree. The way this works is you would first confirm with your academic department that you do need some type of internship to graduate. And then you would contact our office, and we would give you the information about how to request this type of work authorization, basically providing a request form, giving us your employer's information, and then we would review it to make sure you're eligible for CPT, and then also your internship instructor would sign off on it, and your academic department would also sign off to verify that, yes, this internship meets the student's academic program requirements. And then we would provide you with an updated I-20 that gives you the authorization to work off campus for that semester only. For optional practical training, this is something that F1 students can apply for in their graduating semester, or even within the 60-day grace period that you would have after graduation. This work authorization is going to allow you to work off campus in a job that's related to your major for up to 1 year after you've graduated. So this work authorization is after you graduate, CPT is before you graduate. So let's say you are an accounting major, you graduate with your accounting degree, you get approved for OPT. Now you can find an off-campus job that's related to accounting to gain experience in your field. Optional practical training employment is full-time, so it's anything over 20 hours a week. And you would also request that type of work authorization first by contacting our office. We would issue you an OPT I-20, and then you would need to apply with USCIS, who would actually grant the OPT work authorization by providing you an EAD card. So if you have any interest in applying for any of these types of work authorizations, feel free to reach out to us. But again, as I previously stated, unfortunately, the NIL compensation doesn't really fit with these types of F1 work authorizations. That's why they warn you against pursuing any NIL compensation opportunities, because you typically couldn't be authorized for those types of work. So basically, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, the way they consider work in the U.S. Is pretty general, but if you look at this slide, it kind of helps you to understand if you do any work on U.S. soil for anyone or any company located anywhere on Earth, that is considered work by USCIS and the Department of Homeland Security. So that basically means while you're here in the country and your F1 status and you're performing work for a company that's either here in the US or even abroad, and you're receiving some type of compensation for that, that would be basically a violation of your F1 status. Even if you're working online for a foreign company and you're paid to a foreign bank account, that would still be considered a violation of your F1 because you do not have work authorization to do that. If you're on US soil, then they are working without authorization and of course violating the visa. Okay, so again, this is another breakdown of the types of departments in the US that would monitor your work while you're here in the US. The IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, and the Department of Homeland Security work closely together to investigate immigration violations. Companies and brands must report all payments to individuals to the IRS. So that means if you're working for a company here in the US without authorization, then that company is still reporting that you're obtaining compensation here in the US. So IRS and DHS are aware that you've now violated your F1 employment. I'm sorry, your F1 regulations. The CBP, which is Customs and Border Protection, note that personal properties such as your phone or your computer are eligible for legal search every time you enter the country. So when you're coming in the Customs and Border Protection point of entry, they have the authority to request to review your phone and to review your laptop. And if they find any documentation on there that proves that you are working in the US without authorization, that is another consideration of your status violation. And that, again, that can result in them not allowing you to enter the US and returning you to your home country, and even canceling your visa. And you might also be subject to what's called a bar from the US, a 3 or 10 year bar that would not allow you to return to the US in F1 status until that bar is lifted. So again, very harsh consequences for working without authorization. US consulates, so basically where you applied for your US F1 visa, the Department of State requires that students disclose social media handles on the DS-160 visa application form, and they will be able to access your social media profiles at any time. So again, they might see on there that you have been making posts for a athletics company, and they're providing some type of compensation for you, that would question your ability to work in the U.S. and the type of work authorization that you hold. And as I mentioned, USCIS, the United States, and the SEVP, students, when you're applying for work or applying for like a green card, they're going to go back and they're going to look at your history as an F1 student. If they see any possible tax records or any resumes or CVs in your CVIS record, they can determine if you had work authorization at the time of that employment or if you were violating your work authorization anytime. So again, there's many ways that U.S. Immigration or U.S. IRS can determine that you have worked without authorization, even if the ISS office didn't catch it. And again, so since it's your F1 status, it is your responsibility to make sure that you maintain those rules and regulations, or else you could face these harsh consequences. Status violations can be determined years after the fact by the Department of Homeland Security, USCIS, or the Port of Entry. When you're applying for another visa, possibly applying for an extension of your visa, or maybe applying for OPT in the future, or even a green card. As I mentioned, typically when you're applying for these types of benefits, they're looking at your previous history as an F1. And if they see that you have violated your status, usually that's going to result in a denial for whatever you're whatever you're applying for currently. Okay, so this slide is kind of gives you some information about the danger of social media. Maybe you think that, as a student, it would be okay to just post things online, and maybe the company that you're posting for, maybe they're not providing, cash compensation. Maybe they're providing you, free merchandise or things like that. Unfortunately, that's still considered compensation by U.S. Immigration, so that would be a violation of your F1 status. So be careful that, income derived from social media posts while you are physically in the U.S. is considered unauthorized off-campus work, and it's a violation of your F1 status. Even a simple post can be a violation. So remember, companies do not know and typically do not care about you violating your immigration status. They only want your name, your image, your likeness, so they can make money, and they're required by law to report what they pay you to the IRS. So as I previously mentioned, now the IRS is aware that you have been working in the US. So what happens if you do violate your F1 status by working without authorization in the US, by possibly engaging in this NIL compensation agreement? Basically, if you are reported to be violating your status by working without authorization, generating active income while you're here in the US, the ISS is required by law to act on submitted evidence from reports of student violations. And once we confirm that violation, we are going to basically terminate your F1 record by reporting that information to the Department of Homeland Security. So again, working without authorization would result in your ability to remain in the US. So a lot of students have questions about, well, can I engage in NIL agreements while I'm outside of the US? Yes, you can. So content and products can be created when outside of the US. But what's important is that once you're back in the US, and you're on US soil, you can't touch or follow up on those products or work on them and continue to generate revenue or exchange it for something of worth, like maybe stocks or something like that, or merchandise, as I previously mentioned. So if you go home for summer, you're no longer here in the US, you can choose to engage with an NIL agreement as long as you're outside of the US, you're obtaining the funds in your home country. But as soon as you return to the US, you can no longer continue with that NIL agreement, because now you're back in the US and you're continuing to receive income based on the work that you did outside of the US. Okay, so I'm going to get into the frequently asked questions that we have on our website. You're always welcome to review the ISS website, where we have this information posted if you forget or you want to review this information in the future. So an F1 student, are they eligible to receive compensation under the new NIL legislation? Unfortunately, US visa regulations prevent NIL compensation for international students while in the US, and there may also be tax implications. Therefore, international student athletes must not enter into any NIL agreements without the guidance to guard against any potential immigration issues. NIL opportunities conducted while in the U.S. In F1 status would potentially and likely violate U.S. immigration law. Is an F1 international student athlete able to engage in an NIL activity for compensation during breaks, such as winter break, spring break, or summer break, while they're in their home country, including social media endorsements for U.S. companies, products, or services? Yes, as I previously mentioned, when an international student athlete is in their home country, they may receive compensation for services from a U.S. company. U.S. employment and tax laws are based on the physical location of the individual. So if you're outside the U.S., it's okay. But again, remember, as soon as you return to the U.S., you need to cease all employment or activity based on that NIL compensation. Is an F1 international student athlete able to engage in an NIL activity for compensation during breaks while in their home country, which involves endorsements? Yes, as long as you're in your home country, the compensation for the services, while in their home country, which involve endorsements for companies, products, or services not located within the U.S. So the previous FAQ was for companies that were based in the U.S. This one is for companies that are not within the U.S. So both are okay as long as the student athlete is outside of the country. Is an F1 international student athlete with their own business based in their home country or any country outside the U.S. able to conduct business for that company or engage in NIL activities for that company while they're in the U.S. on the F1 visa? Again, no, because the international student is in the U.S. at the time that they're engaging in that activity, even though the company is based outside the U.S., that would still be considered a violation of the F1 visa regulations. Is an F1 international student athlete able to conduct business for a company or engage in NIL activities for a company while in the U.S. on a visa if the funds are directly deposited to the student's foreign account? No, again, even though the funds are deposited in your foreign account, the international student athlete cannot engage in services for a business or company while in the U.S. without proper authorization. So again, the key here is that you're in the U.S. when you're performing the service, so that would be considered a violation of your F1 status. Is an F1 international student athlete eligible to apply for CPT or OPT work authorization to engage in NIL activities? So this one depends. The NIL activity must be able to qualify for the CPT or OPT post-graduation requirements. And it is rare that an NIL activity would qualify for either of these. However, if you do receive an NIL opportunity, you're certainly welcome to contact us and we can review your academic program and the type of NIL compensation or engagement that you would have and let you know if that would be considered a violation or not, and if there could be a CPT or OPT authorization provided for that type of agreement. Okay, so that is basically the presentation. So what we have here is our contact information. And as I mentioned, I'm going to be sending everyone a follow-up email after the presentation that has our student attestation form attached. And I would ask that you fill that form out. And it's basically verifying that you have attended today's training and that you are aware of the rules and requirements for an F1 student concerning NIL. If you have any questions, you're welcome to unmute yourself and to ask any questions you have, or you can always email us at iss@stedwards.edu. And you can also schedule an appointment to meet with us over Zoom or to come into the office by visiting our website. And on there, you'll see a book now option, a make an appointment option, where you can schedule an appointment either via Zoom or in person. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen. And if anyone has any questions, as I mentioned, you're welcome to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask any questions, or you're also welcome to type them into the chat.
Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you, Jacob. I just wanted to comment. I'm really glad you pointed out that it could be years and years later that an incident might show up that could really impact the student, that it might not show up now or in 6 months or even before they graduate. Because those are the stories that we hear. It happens much, much later usually.
Yes, very good point.
Jacob, thank you. Thank you and Kathy for your time. We
Sure.
appreciate it.
Yeah, you're certainly welcome. And as I mentioned, I'm going to send a follow-up email with the attestation form, and then anyone who couldn't attend or couldn't view the whole presentation, I'll provide them a link to watch the recording.
Great.